There is a country in Western Europe that has been conquered, occupied, legislated against, mocked, stripped of its laws, drained of its resources, and told repeatedly for centuries that it does not really exist as a nation. And yet, it is still here. Its language is still spoken, its flag still flies, its stories are still told. That country is Wales. Today, most people outside Britain would struggle to place Wales on a map. It is a small country, about 170 miles long and 60 miles wide, and it sits in the shadow of England, its vastly larger and more powerful neighbor to the east. For many, Wales registers only as a vague association: sheep, rain, rugby, maybe a castle or two. But beneath that quiet surface lies one of the most extraordinary survival stories in European history. Not survival through military power, not survival through empire, survival through something far more stubborn and far more fragile: language, memory, and the sheer refusal to forget who you are. To understand that stubbornness, you have to start with the land itself. Wales is not gentle terrain. The interior is a crumpled mass of mountains, valleys, and ridges that have, for millennia, made centralized control nearly impossible. The Romans pushed into Wales, but never fully pacified it. The Saxons pressed against its borders for centuries, but could not swallow it whole. Even the name Wales is not Welsh. It comes from the Old English word Wallace, meaning foreigners or strangers. The Welsh, in their own language, call themselves Cymry, which means fellow countrymen, and their land Cymru. From the very beginning, the question of who gets to name this place and what that name means has been at the heart of everything. And it is in this land of mist and defiance that some of the oldest stories in all of European literature were born. Stories that predate Chaucer by centuries. Stories that contain the seeds of King Arthur, the blueprint for Tolkien, and a vision of the world so strange and beautiful that once you hear it, you never quite forget it. This is the story of Wales, not as a footnote to English history, but as a civilization that bent without breaking over and over again for more than 1,000 years. Before the castles, before the conquests, before any of the trauma that would define Wales for centuries, there was a world held together by voices. In early medieval Wales, roughly the 6th through 12th centuries, political power was fragmented among small kingdoms: Gwynedd in the mountainous north, Deheubarth in the southwest, Powys in the Midlands. Others rose and fell with the fortunes of their ruling families. There was no single Welsh king, no unified state. What held the Welsh together was not a government, it was a culture. And at the center of that culture stood the bard. The bard in medieval Wales was not a romantic figure strumming a harp on a hillside. He was a professional, trained for years in the intricacies of Welsh poetic meter, genealogy, law, and history. Under the legal code of Hwyl Da, one of the most sophisticated legal systems in medieval Europe, the court poet held the rank of the 14th most important person in the kingdom. He was exempt from military service. His harp could not be seized for debt. When the bard spoke in the great hall, firelight on the faces of warriors and lords, he was doing something far more important than entertainment. He was telling people who they were. And the greatest stories he told became the collection we now call the Mabinogion, pronounced roughly Mab-in-o-gi-on. These were not children's fairy tales. The Mabinogion, compiled from centuries of oral tradition and written down in medieval Welsh in the 13th and 14th centuries, is a dense, layered, and sometimes bewilderingly strange body of work. At its core are the four branches of the Mabinogi, four interlocking narratives that read like mythology, political allegory, and psychological drama all at once. In the first branch, a prince named Pwyll accidentally offends the king of the otherworld, a figure called Aran, and must swap bodies with him for a year. He sleeps chastely beside Aran's wife, fights Aran's enemies, rules Aran's kingdom. When he returns, he meets Rhiannon, pronounced Rhiannon, a woman on a shining white horse who can never be caught by pursuit, but stops the moment you simply ask her to. She is no passive princess. She chooses her own husband, engineers her own rescue, and endures 7 years of unjust punishment with a dignity that shames every man around her. In the second branch, the giant king, Bronn the Blessed, wades across the Irish Sea, too large for any ship, to rescue his sister, Bronwen, from an abusive marriage. The war that follows is apocalyptic. A magical cauldron resurrects the dead. Bronn is mortally wounded and orders his own men to cut off his head, and the head continues to speak, to advise, to comfort for 80 years. In the third branch, the land of Dyfed is struck by an enchantment that erases every living thing, every person, every animal, every column of hearth smoke. Only 4 survivors are left, wandering through an empty world. One of them, Manawydan, the rightful heir to the throne of all Britain, is reduced to farming 3 tiny fields of wheat. When even that harvest is devoured by a horde of mice, he catches the slowest one, fat and sluggish, and builds a miniature gallows to hang it as a thief. It is absurd. It is also deadly serious. The mouse turns out to be the shape-shifted wife of the sorcerer who cursed the land, and Manawydan's stubborn, almost comical insistence on justice is what breaks the spell. It is a story that says something very Welsh, that patience, cleverness, and a refusal to be humiliated will outlast any magic. In the fourth branch, 2 magicians create a woman out of flowers, oak blossom, broom, and meadowsweet. She is made to be a wife for a cursed hero who can never marry a human woman. They name her Blodeuwedd, which means flower face. But Blodeuwedd was given no choice in her own creation. She falls in love with another man, conspires to kill her husband, and is punished by being transformed into an owl, a creature that will forever haunt the night, shunned by all other birds. It is a story about power, consent, and what happens when you create a being solely for someone else's convenience. It was told in the 12th century. It feels like it could have been told yesterday. What sets the Mabinogion apart from most ancient mythology is what it refuses to do. There are no clear villains. There are no uncomplicated heroes. Rhiannon is wronged but never rescued by a sword. She is vindicated by evidence and patience. Blodeuwedd is punished, but the story never quite lets you feel comfortable with the punishment. Bronn's severed head is grotesque and tender at the same time. The world of the Mabinogion does not divide neatly into good and evil. It divides into choices and consequences, and the consequences are never free. That moral complexity is what makes these 1,000-year-old stories feel not ancient but modern. These stories were not meant to be read on a page. They were meant to be heard in a hall, by firelight, in a language that wrapped around the ear like smoke. And for centuries, that was enough. The voice carried the nation. But voices, unlike stone, can be silenced. In the autumn of 1282, a spear found the throat of Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, near the village of Kilmerry. His head was cut from his body and sent to London, where it was crowned with ivy and mounted on a pike at the Tower of London. It remained there for years. If you know the Mabinogion, this scene carries a sickening echo. In the second branch, the giant Bran orders his head severed and buried at the White Hill in London, traditionally identified as the site of the tower, to protect Britain from invasion. Llewellyn's head, displayed at that same tower, was not protection. It was a message. The age of Welsh sovereignty was over. Edward I of England did not simply defeat Wales, he redesigned it. Between 1283 and 1330, the English crown constructed a network of enormous stone castles across North Wales: Carnarvon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, Flint. Historians call this network the Iron Ring. These were not medieval fortresses in the usual sense. They were statements of permanent dominance, built with cutting-edge military architecture imported from the Crusades, financed by staggering sums, and designed to be visible from each other across the landscape. Stand in one castle and you could see the next. The message was geometric. There is no gap in our control. Wales today has over 600 castles, more per square mile than any country on Earth. That fact sounds charming in a travel brochure. In reality, it is a scar. Every one of those castles was built either by a Welsh lord trying to defend his land, or by an English king trying to take it. The density of fortification is not a sign of romance. It is a sign of how fiercely and how often this small country was fought over.
But Edward's conquest went beyond stone. The Statute of Rutland in 1284 imposed English law on Wales, sidelining the Welsh legal tradition that had governed the country for centuries. Welsh people were barred from holding office in the new borough towns that grew up around the castles. The old patronage system that had sustained the bardic class began to crumble. The stories did not stop being told, but the world that had given them meaning was being dismantled, stone by stone. And yet, and this is the part that matters, someone in the middle of this collapse sat down with ink and vellum and began to write the old stories down. Two manuscripts saved the Mabinogion. The first, known as the White Book of Rhydderch, was copied around 1350. The second, called the Red Book of Hergest, was copied between 1382 and 1410. Together, they preserved the Mabinogion and much of the rest of medieval Welsh literature. We do not know exactly who commissioned them or why, but the timing is not accidental. These books were created in the decades after the conquest, in a period when the oral tradition that had carried Welsh culture for centuries was under existential threat. Writing the stories down was not scholarship, it was rescue. It was a culture that had lost its kingdom, deciding that it would not lose its memory.
One more act of defiance deserves mention. In 1400, more than a century after Llewellyn's death, a Welsh nobleman named Owen Glyndwr raised a rebellion against English rule. He was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers, established a Welsh parliament, proposed Welsh universities, and for a few extraordinary years, it looked as though Welsh independence might actually be restored. It was not. Glyndwr's rebellion was crushed, and he himself vanished. Literally, no one knows where or when he died. His grave has never been found. In Welsh memory, he did not die. He is sleeping, like Arthur, waiting to return. The castles still stand, but so do the manuscripts, and in the long run, it was the manuscripts that mattered more.
If the medieval conquests tried to break Wales politically, the modern era tried to break it linguistically. By the 16th century, the Act of Union of 1536 formally annexed Wales into England and declared that English would be the sole language of law and administration. Welsh speakers, who were the vast majority of the population, were effectively locked out of public life unless they abandoned their own tongue. For 300 years, Welsh survived in kitchens, chapels, fields, and bedtime stories, but it was pushed steadily out of every space that carried power. The cruelest weapon came in the 19th century, and it was aimed at children. In 1847, the British government published a report on education in Wales, a report that became known ever after as the Treason of the Blue Books. It described the Welsh as ignorant, lazy, and morally deficient, blaming their backwardness on their attachment to the Welsh language. In schools across Wales, a practice emerged called the Welsh knot. It was a wooden plaque, sometimes carved with the letters WN, hung around any child caught speaking Welsh in the classroom. The child wore it in shame until they heard another child speak Welsh, at which point they passed the plaque on. Whoever was wearing it at the end of the day was beaten. Think about that for a moment. Children punished for speaking their mother tongue in their own country. And yet, Welsh did not die. It bent. It retreated into the chapels of nonconformist Christianity, where sermons were preached in Welsh and hymns were sung in four-part harmony that could shake the walls. It survived in the Eisteddfod, the annual festival of poetry, music, and storytelling, pronounced roughly Eisteddfod, that traces its roots to a medieval bardic competition held by Lord Rhys in 1176 at Cardigan Castle. The Eisteddfod was revived, reinvented, and fiercely maintained through the centuries as a space where Welsh was not merely tolerated, but celebrated. And the language survived in the farms of Snowdonia and the Leen Peninsula, where English was simply not needed and therefore never took root. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was remaking South Wales into something unrecognizable. The valleys that had been green and quiet for centuries were torn open for coal. By the mid-19th century, the South Wales coal field was one of the most productive in the world, fueling the British Empire's ships and factories. Towns like Merthyr Tydfil, Pontypridd, and the Rhondda Valley swelled with workers. Welsh-speaking rural families who poured down from the hills, joined by migrants from England, Ireland, and beyond. The work was brutal. Children as young as 5 hauled coal in the darkness. Life expectancy in the mining towns was shockingly low. The coal brought wealth, but not to the people who dug it. It flowed east to English industrialists and London shareholders. What it left behind in Wales was a new kind of identity. Working class, collective, fiercely proud, and deeply aware that the system was not built for their benefit. The choral traditions of the chapels merged with the solidarity of the pit. The rugby clubs that sprang up in the valleys became tribal rallying points, and the Welsh language, though it lost ground in the anglicized south, held firm in the rural west and north. Then, on the morning of October 21st, 1966, the rain-soaked spoil tip above the village of Aberfan collapsed. It was a mountain of coal waste that the National Coal Board had piled on top of a natural spring, and it slid downhill in a black avalanche of slurry. It hit Pantglass Junior School at 9:15 in the morning, just after the children had returned to their classrooms from assembly. 116 children died. 28 adults died. The youngest victim was 3 months old. Aberfan was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe, the direct result of decades of negligence by an institution that had treated Welsh land and Welsh lives as expendable raw material. The official inquiry found the coal board entirely responsible, and yet the board was never prosecuted. The government forced the Aberfan Disaster Fund, money donated by ordinary people around the world, to contribute £150,000 toward removing the remaining tips. It was not repaid for 30 years. Aberfan crystallized something that had been building for centuries. The understanding that Wales's pain was not incidental, it was structural, and that if Wales wanted to protect itself, it would have to find its own voice again, not just culturally, but politically.
The fight back began, as it often does in Wales, with language. In 1962, a BBC radio lecture by the writer Saunders Lewis, titled "The Fate of the Language," lit a fuse. Lewis argued, bluntly and publicly, that the Welsh language was dying and that only direct action could save it. Within months, the Welsh Language Society was founded. Its members, mostly young, mostly students, began a campaign of civil disobedience that would last decades. They painted over English-only road signs. They refused to pay taxes to councils that would not offer Welsh language services. They went to jail. They were mocked by the English press and occasionally by their own parents, and they won. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 gave Welsh limited legal standing for the first time since the 16th century. A second act in 1993 established the principle that Welsh and English should be treated equally in public life. Welsh language television arrived in 1982 with the launch of a channel called S4C, after another campaign that included the threat by the veteran politician Gwynfor Evans to starve himself to death if the government broke its promise to create the channel.
The results have been remarkable. In 1911, roughly half the population of Wales spoke Welsh. By 1981, the figure had fallen to about 19%. Today, it has stabilized at around 29%, nearly 900,000 people, and among children, the numbers are rising. Welsh medium schools have waiting lists. Walk into a Welsh medium primary school in Cardiff or Carmarthen today, and you will hear 5-year-olds chattering in a language that a Victorian education inspector tried to beat out of their great-great-grandparents. Many of their parents speak no Welsh at all. They chose Welsh medium education deliberately, not out of nostalgia, but out of a conviction that the language carries something English cannot replace. The children grow up bilingual without effort, switching between Welsh and English mid-sentence, the way their ancestors once switched between the spoken tale and the sung poem. It is not a museum revival. It is a living, noisy, thoroughly ordinary miracle, which is exactly the kind of miracle that lasts. And alongside the language, something larger has shifted. In 1997, Wales voted, by the narrowest of margins, just over 50%, to create its own devolved government, now known as the Senedd. For the first time since Owen Glyndwr's vanished parliament 6 centuries earlier, Wales had a national legislature. It does not have the powers of a sovereign state. It cannot declare war or print currency, but it can set education policy, health policy, and critically, language policy. It is, in the most practical sense, a Welsh voice in a room that had been English only for 500 years.
The Eisteddfod, meanwhile, has become something extraordinary. It is one of the largest cultural festivals in Europe, drawing over 150,000 visitors every year. For 1 week each August, an entire town is temporarily rebuilt around a central pavilion where poets compete for the chair and the crown, the highest honors in Welsh literary life. The ceremony is conducted entirely in Welsh. The archdruid, robed in white, calls for peace with a sword half drawn from its sheath. It is theatrical, ancient, slightly absurd, and deeply sincere, which, if you think about it, is a fair description of Wales itself. Stand in the ruins of Harlech Castle on a winter evening, and you can see the sea. The castle was built to subjugate. It was designed to remind the Welsh every single day that they had lost. But the Welsh wrote a song about it, Men of Harlech, and turned the conqueror's fortress into their own anthem. That, in miniature, is the entire history of Wales. This is a country that has been told it is not a real country more times than anyone can count. It has no seat at the United Nations. It does not issue its own passport. For most of its recorded history, it has been governed by someone else. And yet it persists, not as a museum piece, not as a quaint regional curiosity, but as a living culture with a living language and a fierce, sometimes bewildering insistence on its own existence. The Mabinogion is still in print. Rhiannon still rides her white horse through the imagination of anyone who hears her story. Blodeuwedd still haunts the night as an owl, the flower woman who dared to want a life of her own choosing. These are not relics, they are active ingredients in a national identity that has survived everything history could throw at it. And the mechanism of that survival is worth understanding, because it was never military. Wales did not outfight its conquerors. It did not build a larger empire. It did not even, for most of its history, have a state. What it had was a tradition of remembering, of encoding identity into language, poetry, song, and story with such density and such emotional force that no amount of political suppression could fully erase it.
The bards of the medieval court understood something that modern nations often forget. A people is not defined by its borders, or its army, or its economy. A people is defined by the stories it tells about itself. Change the story, and you change the people. Kill the story, and you kill the nation, no matter how many of its citizens remain alive. Wales nearly lost its story, more than once. The conquest of 1282 shattered the political order that had sustained the bardic tradition. The Acts of Union erased Welsh from public life. The Blue Books tried to shame it out of the classroom. The coal industry extracted the land's wealth and left its grief behind. Aberfan buried the children. And still, the language is spoken. The Eisteddfod convenes. The stories are told. There is a Welsh word, hiraeth, pronounced roughly hiraeth, that has no direct English translation. It is often described as a longing for something lost, a homesickness for a home that may no longer exist or may never have existed in quite the way you remember it. It is not sadness exactly. It is the ache of knowing that something precious is always on the verge of slipping away, and the determination to hold on to it anyway. That is Wales. Not the castles, not the mountains, not even the language exactly. It is the refusal to let go, the insistence that the story matters, the quiet, stubborn conviction that if you keep telling it,
in the halls, in the chapels, in the schools, in the Senate, in the kitchen at midnight, then the thing the story carries will survive. Empires leave behind ruins. Wales left behind a voice, and the voice is still speaking.